Thank you for returning once again to Wildstar's History of Nexus. It's time for the beginning of the end with the discovery of Nexus. Chapter 10, Part 2, Ghost World. After the events of Arborea, the Exile fleet lay in tatters. The majority of its ancient ramshackle space hulks were battered and crumbling. Provision stockpiles, always stretched thin, had dwindled to critical levels. Weathering another concerted attack would finish them. But not only was such conflict inevitable, it grew exponentially likelier with each passing jump. Hour after tense hours slid by as sleep-deprived engineers toiled desperately to patch severe hull breaches and scrape the last dregs of fuel from the drums. Barely concealed despair haunted every corridor. Exile commanders anxiously awaited the return of scouts checking for enemy movements ahead. When half of them returned alive, it was considered cause for celebration. The oldest and most respected of these was Dorian Walker. Since the start of the long flight, Walker had proven himself the luckiest, most tenacious pathfinder in the fleet. Despite this, none knew him well. After having lost his wife to space plague, he'd grown increasingly taciturn. But everyone knew that his true passion, second only to the welfare of his daughter Belle, was Nexus. The legendary planet had been a family obsession for generations, even before its patriarch's acquisition of the rare volume known as the Book of Dominus at the start of the Cassian Civil War. Alizar Walker had gone to his grave convinced that it held the clues to the planet's location. One passage that particularly drew his attention had been a cryptic reference to 3 celestial jewels and the River of Green Fire. Dorian had cherished Belle's response to this divulgence at age 12. If they really wanted us to come, some actual coordinates would have been helpful. For years, Dorian scoured ancient star charts and ship's logs, combining them for any references, however obscure, to suggestive celestial anomalies. Ceaselessly, he grilled smugglers for detailed reports of their most memorable sights. With trinary systems so commonplace and green nebulae non-existent, it was arduous work. Then one day, he hit pay dirt. It came in the unlikely form of an old spacer named Clegg he found slouched in a miserable watering hole on the Gambler's Ruin. His eyes lit up at Dorian's diagram of the nebula that he had sketched himself from the book. Clegg hadn't recorded the nebula's coordinates, but another drink would likely help him recall the quadrant. Heart-pounding, Dorian obliged. The next day, after scrawling a hasty note to Belle and a terser apologetic one to his superiors, Dorian stole the horizon and soared off into the unknown, certain in his heart that salvation was at hand. If they really wanted us to come, some actual coordinates would have been helpful. And that's my impression of a 12-year-old girl. Damn this natural baritone of mine.